Chapter 6, Black and Indigenous Social Movement. The national and transnational context has become a vital one for understanding ethnic and racial identities, partly because of the emergence of movements that seek to revitalize those identities and make Indigenous people and Blacks, or Afro-descendants, as recent terminology has it, into players in the politics of economy and culture. These movements often feed on symbolic and concrete links with each other and with movements outside Latin America, which is what makes the transnational context important too. Black and Indigenous social movements have been around for a long time. Recent ethnohistorical works have highlighted the importance of slave and Indigenous rebellions, how runaway slaves, or cimarrones, formed renegade communes, palenques and quilombos, the contribution of slave resistance to abolition, and so on. The Frente Negra Brasileira was active in the 1930s. Black organizations were around in Brazil when the UNESCO studies were being carried out in the 1950s, and the movement for Negro Unificado was formed there in 1978. In Colombia, Black organizations date from the 1970s. Indigenous rights organizations likewise spring up all over Latin America from about the 1960s. However, it has been from the 1980s that these movements have gained strength and multiplied. Also, new has been the advent of official multiculturalism since the late 1980s, in which many states across the region have recognized ethnic diversity and enshrined rights for Indigenous and, in some cases, Afro-descendant people in their constitutions and legislations. New social movements. The reason why Black and Indigenous social movements have attracted attention in the last couple of decades is partly because of their proliferation, but also because they form part of a more general phenomenon also dating from the mid-1960s, but accelerating from the 1980s, termed new social movements, although there's been debate about how new they really are. They include everything from squatters associations, Christian-based communities, gay rights groups, and animal rights campaigners to workers' cooperatives, Indigenous land rights organizations, and ecological groups. They are said to be new because they seem to be different from the classic trade unions, workers' protests of earlier decades. There is less of an emphasis on earlier modernization or revolution as the basic options, and more in the multiplicity of political spaces that can be carved out in the nation and the globe, in which politics is no longer a separate level, but is integral to social life. There is also often less emphasis on the sphere of production, labor versus capital, and more on reproduction, for example, of the environment, whether urbanized or rural. Almost all new social movements, a divide has been identified between strategy and identity. The extent to which a movement focuses on strategic instrumental ends, for example, obtaining land, or on asserting a right to a cultural space for its identity. Alvarez et al. Contend that the two aspects should not be divided. There is always a culture of politics and a politics of culture. The point is that identity as an end in itself, whether it is linked to a material right or not, and it almost always is, constitutes something of a new trend. The context for the emergence of these movements is complex. Hall contends that the decentering of the modern subject and the dislocation of stable foci identification by globalization has brought about a new search for identities. Escobar argues that, for many in Latin America, modernity itself has failed as a project and forms of grassroots collective action have emerged. Such movements can propose adjustments to the process of development, which tailor the processes more towards local people. They can also propose alternative modernities, which seek to promote and defend marginalized ways of life, or even radical alternatives to modernity itself, which challenge the very basis of capitalism and progress. In a similar vein, Kearney writes that in this post-development movement in Latin America, conditions that promote diversity appear to be deepening, creating a climate conducive to the resurgence of Indigenous identities. Also important are two interrelated sets of factors. On the one hand, although exploitation and oppression of ethnic and racial minorities in Latin America and elsewhere has been long-standing, it is reasonable to suggest that changes in the global economy over the last few decades, structural adjustment, neoliberal reform, have intensified pressures on these peoples, both integrating them more strongly into national and global economies and subjecting them to exploitation. It is well known that neoliberal reforms, by opening markets to global trade and rolling back state protection from vulnerable classes, has increased impoverishment in many areas. One need only to look at the process of development in the Amazon basin or the Pacific coastal regions of Ecuador and Colombia to see how Afro-descendant and indigenous people have been disadvantaged. The reaction of the largely indigenous population of Bolivia to neoliberal proposals to privatize water and gas in 2000 and 2003 was a reflection of, but also a major spur to, indigenous organizations there. Similarly, neoliberal reforms have often been cited as one of the key spurs to the emergence of the indigenous-based armed groups Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, EZLN, in Chiapas, Mexico. On the other hand, although there has been a consciousness among indigenous and Afro-descendant groups of their location within the national and indeed international social order, see Chapter 5, it is also reasonable to suggest that this consciousness has intensified and spread more widely in recent decades. This process has been spurred by increasing levels of education, especially higher education. It is no accident that early Black organizers in Colombia were university students. It has also been prompted by growth of transnational communication society, which has fostered knowledge among minorities of the worldwide context of decolonialization and of other indigenous and Black movements elsewhere in the world, especially in North America. Of vital importance, too, has been the growth of international interest in indigenous matters, as evident, for example, in International Labor Organization Convention 168 of 1989 and the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples of 1994. Black and indigenous social movements draw symbolic and material strength from a transnational network of multilateral organizations, NGOs, and other social movements, as well as globalized and often commoditized cultural representations of indigenous and Blackness. Although international conventions and declarations may have little legal binding force, they are quasi-judicial instruments that can be used to strengthen claims made both nationally and locally. In this regard, the globalization of discourses of human rights has been significant. The language of rights has penetrated into ever-growing areas of political discourse and into areas previously regarded as private, such as child labor, child abuse, or organ trafficking. Claims about land, culture, access to resources, education, racism, and so on can be phrased as claims to human rights, and this gives them international legitimacy while also universalizing their appeal. The human rights perspective remains a claim. It is no longer a demand to be made for a special treatment by a culturally distinct group of people. It is a demand to be treated as human by people who just happen to be culturally distinctive. At the extreme, it is claimed that the right to have one's cultural difference recognized and respected as a human right. This universalizes the right to difference and makes it pure a part of the natural social order. The people who claim this right have been denied to them are cast as victims in need of reparation rather than troublemakers bent on securing special privileges. Indigenous and Black minorities growing consciousness of their own identity and position does not take place only from the bottom up. As it were, it is a process strongly mediated by a variety of non-Indigenous people and institutions which complicate any simple divide between grassroots ethnic social movements and the dominant society. First, the Catholic Church, influenced by liberation theology and its concern for the poor, has been very important in supporting and indeed initiating both Indigenous and Black social movements at a local level, often through broader regional programs such as the Pastoral Afro-Americana. Second, indigenous movements depend on what Rapport calls collaboradores. These non-indigenous collaborators, academics like herself, supporters, priests, and advisors form an important part of the movement. Rappaport shows how internationally heterogeneous the indigenous movement is, not only in terms of non-indigenous participation, but also because of the varied positions of different indigenous activists. Some well-educated, others less so, some educators themselves, some not, some very local activists, others with more cosmopolitan national and international experiences. A similar picture emerges when looking at the Zapatista movement in Mexico. This is often taken to consist of the armed group, the EZLN, but Leiva Solano argues that the Zapatismo movement is comprised of multiple networks connecting various sectors of civil society, including women's organizations, radical left-wing organizations, and individuals, and international activists and networkers. Also vital is the globalizing discourse of human rights, which the Zapatistas use to mobilize local, national, and transnational networks and alliances. Third, the state itself is a very significant interlocutor and mediator of ethnic social movements. This will become apparent throughout this chapter, so I will not enter into detail here. The point is that it is naive to think in terms of a simple opposition between the state and ethnic movements. The mere fact that many Latin American states have conceded special legal rights to indigenous and less often Black groups complicates such a divide. A final important factor in understanding the emergence of ethnic movements in Latin America is a regional process of democratization and changing regimes of citizenship. Yashar argues that processes of democratization, which were dismantling the region's dictatorships, open spaces for political expression and participation of various kinds. At the same time, neoliberal citizenship reforms, which privilege the individual and marginalize collective work, cooperative identities, and loyalties, undermine the spaces of autonomy that many indigenous communities have managed to establish vis-a-vis the state. This puts them under threat and, paradoxically, spurred precisely the kind of collective identity and organization that the reforms had aimed to undo, providing that communities had some kind of trans-community network to facilitate this process. Black and Indigenous mobilizations. Yashar's particular argument applies more to Indigenous than Black peoples insofar as it refers to the partial autonomy of Indigenous communities in the nation-state. In general, it is noticeable that, despite the strides made by Afro-Colombian and Afro-Brazilian movements, among others, Indigenous organizations have generally been more successful than Black organizations, as shown by the example from Colombia given in Chapter 2. In my view, this is to do with the historical institutionalization of Indigenous identity, which gave Indigenous people a conceptual, political, and often a territorial basis, hence the importance of land rights struggles on which to organize themselves. This is the autonomy that Yashar states was threatened by neoliberal citizenship regimes. An institutionalized identity also helped Indigenous people to gain international backing. Blacks, in contrast, have not had this historical basis. Observers such as Toplin, Delger, Skidmore, and Hassenboldt also argue that, whether due specifically to the special place of the Pardo, or more generally to a system based on the mestizaje, with the possibility of whitening, Black mobilization was inherently difficult to achieve because of the ambiguity of the Black category. This is still the case to some extent, but previous analyses, by treating Black mobilization as blocked by a permanent structural obstacle, found that it's hard to account for the evident mobilization that has occurred. I think it is more fruitful to relate to Black political mobilization to the overall political context, as others have done with indigenous mobilization, so that, for example, in Brazil, it flowered with democratic opening and in Colombia with constitutional reform. It is interesting then that where Black groups have mobilized with a degree of success, there has been a tendency for them to adopt a stance that positions them as indigenous-like. This is evident in the case of Colombia and also Honduras, although in a distinctive way. In Colombia, as briefly mentioned in Chapter 2, constitutional reform in 1991 led to the law of 1993, which recognized Black communities as ethnic groups and accorded them special rights, although not as fully as for indigenous people. Notably, the law confined itself principally to rural riverine Black communities in the Pacific coastal region, which were defined in terms of traditional production practices and rooted residents on their lands. And the image conveyed was of a bounded ethnic group, similar to the image of indigenous groups. This was because the state was accustomed to dealing with indigenous-style ethnic groups, and thus willing to deal with Black social movements in the same way, and also because really opening up legislative rights to the whole Afro-Colombian population seemed too complex and too threatening. Afro-Colombian movements tended to adapt to this mold, focus on the Pacific coast, and emphasize their cultural and historical difference, playing down the issue of racism, while small urban Afro-Colombian movements struggled to stake a claim in the process, trying to work with the small footholds in the law that could address Afro-Colombians as a wider constituency. Gradually, urban movements have gained some ground, with racism being given more attention, and the state including some broad Black category in the 2005 census. Let's see Chapter 5. This indicates that the indigenous-style mold is not necessarily a permanent straitjacket. In Honduras, and indeed Guatemala and Nicaragua, the Arhuana people were able to claim a position as authentically autochthonous people, equally in legal status to other indigenous peoples because of their particular history plus their cultural distinctiveness, especially their language. The state accepted this equality even if there have been attempts to divide ethnic activism on Black and indigenous lines. Anderson contends that the use of an indigenous-like stance by Black groups is not necessarily negative. A discourse of rooted Black rural indigeneity and discourse of diasporic cosmopolitan urban Blackness coexist for the Garifuna people, and this can be politically productive. It opens up multiple options for identifying rather than simply causing a contradiction. Nicaragua was a front-runner in the process of recognizing minority rights with the Sandinista government in 1986, approving the law on autonomous regions of the Atlantic coast and enshrining multiculturalist policies that protected the rights of Costeños living in the coastal region. Costeños actually compromised a number of indigenous groups, notably the Mitsukis, two groups of Afro-descendants, Creoles and Garifunas, and Mestizos, many of whom had migrated there after about 1900. In this case, differences between these groups were encompassed by a policy that gave rights to a previously marginalized region. But Hooker argues that while this put indigenous and Afro-descendant people on an equal footing and created multiracial and multi-ethnic spaces in which different groups had to communicate and cooperate, it organized the racial hierarchy of Nicaragua, including the fact that the region was marginalized by the nation precisely because it was historically Black and indigenous. This was evident in the inclusion of mestizos as beneficiaries of the law. In fact, because they are the demographic majority, mestizos have attained a dominant position in the institution of regional self-government set up by the law. In practice, communication and cooperation has occurred between indigenous and Afro-descendant groups, increasing subaltern solidarity, but not between mestizos and others, thus reinforcing racialized power differences between dominant and subaltern groups. Mayo et al. Give an example of the subaltern cooperation and communication, not, however, without tension and disagreements between indigenous and Afro-descendants involved in making land claims in the Nicaraguan Atlantic region. Individual communities often made overlapping land claims, but in a majority of cases they negotiated agreements to make multi-community claims, both for strategic reasons of achieving strength in numbers for particular claims and to present a more united Black and Indigenous Costeño front to the state. Some claims reasserted a particular ethnic identity, for example, Garifuna. Other claims are multi-ethnic, like the Honduran case. The Nicaraguan example suggests that potentially productive alliances can form between Indigenous and Black groups when they are positioned on an equal footing. For Black people to be seen as indigenous in some way is not necessarily a problem. Brazil is analogous in some ways to the Colombian case. In the 1988 constitutional reform, land rights were open to remanentes das comunidades dos quilombos, remnants of Quilombo communities, seen as historically rooted communities in indigenous style. Meanwhile, other rights aimed at addressing racial inequality, the most notable having been special access to university places implemented from 2003, have been accorded to the Afro-Brazilian population as a whole in a controversial program of affirmative action. A particularly interesting aspect of Brazil is the reemergence of indigenous communities in the country, and particularly in the northeast of Brazil, an area apparently occupied mostly by Afro-descendant peasant farmers. This is a process of reindustrialization. Or rather, in this area, some communities have asserted an indigenous identity and made land claims based on this, while others have affirmed their identities as quilombolas, claiming land as residents on remnants of quilombos. Some individuals identify as both indigenous and Black. The thing that prompts a community response to go in one direction rather than another often seems to the outside eye rather contingent. Particular bits of historical information, stories, and memories, the role of outside mediators such as priests, who have their own ideas of local history. People within a given community might disagree whether to identify as quilombolas or not. French also shows that legal categories, not only of Indian and Quilombo remnant, but also landowner and sharecropper, and legal processes through which land may be claimed, are important mediators in the process. They constrain and facilitate options for local people. This reemergence of indigenous communities raises the question, by no means confined to the Brazilian case, but common all over Latin America and indeed elsewhere, of authenticity. Are these people real Indians? Are they real Black? Although the question seems to be less often asked, perhaps because Black groups have far fewer opportunities to claim land rights in the Brazilian Northeast, real indigenous people are said to have disappeared many years ago, assimilated by mestiçagem. So, the sudden appearance of people claiming to be indigenous must, it is said, be a fraud. The cultural traditions they lay claim to must be invented traditions and therefore fake. This is a highly complex and ambiguous area in which contradictory stances are common among anthropologists, the state, and social movement activists. Anthropologists, for example, may well try to support specific land claims with historical evidence and data showing hidden indigenous or Afro-descendant histories and practices, in part because legal processes often require such proofs. And in Brazil and elsewhere, anthropologists are contracted by the state to investigate and validate these land claims by indigenous and Afro-descendant communities. In effect, the anthropologists try to show these are real quilombola or indigenous communities. On the other hand, at a more general level, most anthropologists contest arguments about authenticity and try to avoid ideas of invention understood as artificiality. All culture is invented in some sense. Culture, tradition, identity, and land claims are emergent phenomena which should not be validated only by their historical rootedness Agents of the state, for their part, often require that indigenous people prove their identity in legal terms in order to access entitlement defined in law. Around Lake Titicaca, for example, the definition of customary territories for indigenous people has emerged in conflict between National Reserve authorities and Uros leaders. What were once flexible, ill-defined boundaries have become fixed as part of the way the state and the Uros relate to each other in legal procedures. On the other hand, states do not always take an inflexible line. The Brazilian state has been rather accommodating in terms of defining people and their lands, allowing legal recognition of indigeneity for groups previously considered non-indigenous, not just very recently, but over a number of decades. The same goes for the category Quilombo, which is subject to ongoing processing and negotiation and redefinition. In Colombia, too, the legal category of Black community, the ability to make a land claim, was originally restricted to the rural Pacific coastal region, but in a few cases has been recognized by the state outside that region and even part of an urban area. The people who are making land claims, for their part, may choose to emphasize deep-rooted ancestors of blood in order to validate their status as true Indians or Blacks. On the other hand, in Nicaragua, indigenous and Black claimants adopted the discourse of collective memory, collective residence, and collective struggle, all more short-term and less essentialist, to legitimate their claims and their identities. As noted above, in the Brazilian Northeast, some people identify as both indigenous and Black at the same time. These contradictory stances indicate that the matter of authenticity is a terrain of struggle and negotiation, not a question of a simpler definition. Just as one would expect of an important cultural value, I return to the question of authenticity in Chapter 7. The point I wish to make here is that, while there is still a significant difference between the categories Indian and Black, which has important political consequences, the category Indian does not carry any guarantees of authenticity. The Brazilian Northeast case shows particularly well that these two categories share a common ground in terms of contested and negotiated political and cultural processes of identity formation, even if they continue to occupy different imaginary spaces and structures of alterity.